The iron door slammed shut, the sound a physical blow that echoed the finality of her fate. Sable Ashford crumpled to the damp stone floor, the rough fabric of her tunic scratching against her cheek. The darkness was absolute, a thick, cloying blanket that smelled of mildew, stale water, and something metallic and sharp that spoke of old pain. Her breath came in ragged, hiccuping sobs she tried desperately to swallow. They had taken everything. Her small satchel of belongings, the worn, leather-bound book of poems her mother had given her, the very dignity she had clung to during the brutal weeks of her capture and transport. She was nothing now. An Omega from the Silver Moon territory, snatched during a Blackwood border raid, the kind the Blackwood pack had been running with increasing boldness since the Alpha King's disappearance. They hadn't kept the others. The betas captured alongside her had been interrogated for a day and disposed of. But an Omega, alive and terrified, made for better theater. She had heard the guards discussing it on the journey here, their voices casual as they debated dates and moon phases, the way butchers discuss the schedule for a slaughter. She was not a prisoner. She was a spectacle in waiting. A public execution at the next full moon, a message to Silvermoon that the Blackwood pack feared nothing and no one. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She was going to die here, in this forgotten hole, and no one would ever know what became of her. The sobs broke free, raw and animalistic, tearing from her chest in a torrent of despair. She curled into a tight ball, her forehead pressed against the cold, weeping stone, and let the grief consume her. And deep inside her, in the place where her wolf lived, there was only silence. Her wolf had always been small, quiet, an Omega wolf that most people dismissed or ignored, just like they dismissed Sable herself. It had never been strong, but it had been hers, a faint presence at the back of her mind, a warmth she could reach for in lonely moments. Now even that was gone. She had felt it fading during the transport, growing quieter with each mile deeper into Blackwood territory. And here, in this dungeon that reeked of wolfsbane-soaked stone, it had fallen completely silent. She couldn't feel it at all. It was as if a small, gentle light inside her had been snuffed out, and the loss of it was almost worse than the loss of freedom. She was truly alone. A deep voice rumbled through the wall to her right, so low it felt more like a vibration in her bones than a sound in her ears. "Don't let them hear you cry." The voice was gravelly, rough with disuse, yet it held an undercurrent of startling authority. "You have anything left to spend. Sable, you have anything left to spend." Sable froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't alone. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, followed by a bewildering flicker of something else. Not hope. It was too early for hope. It was awareness. She was not the only soul rotting in this pit. She pressed her ear against the stone, straining to hear more. Silence. Had she imagined it? Was the terror making her mind play tricks? She held her breath, listening to the frantic thumping of her own heart. Then, the sound of a slow, heavy exhale, followed by the faint, rhythmic clink of metal on stone. Chains. Her neighbor was in chains. Then, from across the corridor, a second voice, older, thinner, carrying the dry rasp of a throat that had been parched for years. "Listen to him, child. The man has a point, even if his bedside manner is appalling." There was a ghost of humor in the words, a flicker of warmth so unexpected in this frozen hell that it made Sable's breath hitch. "The name is Orrin," the voice continued. "Orrin Birch, Beta, former schoolteacher, current resident of this charming establishment for what I believe is going on 4 years now, though they took my calendar on the first day, so I cannot be entirely sure." A pause, then softer. "You are not alone, girl. I know it feels that way, but you are not alone." She swallowed hard, the salt of her own tears sharp on her tongue. 2 voices, 2 souls in the dark. She took the first voice's advice, muffling her gasps in the crook of her elbow, forcing her breathing to even out, to become as quiet as the oppressive dark. The guards would come eventually, and when they did, she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. The first days bled into a timeless misery. Twice a day, a slot in her door scraped open, and a wooden bowl of thin, tasteless gruel was shoved through, along with a tin cup of murky water. The guards were hulking brutes from the Blackwood pack, their scents acrid with casual cruelty. They never spoke to her, but she could hear their jeering laughter as they passed her cell. They were wolves who preyed on the weak, and she was the weakest of the weak, an omega whose wolf had gone silent. She spent her time huddled in the corner farthest from the door, trying to make herself small, invisible. The cold was a constant ache in her bones, and a gnawing hunger became her permanent companion. But she was not entirely alone. The voice from the next cell, the one she would come to call Wall, became her unlikely anchor. He never offered comfort, never spoke a single word of sympathy. Instead, he offered survival. The one with the scar on his cheek, the voice rumbled one afternoon as the sound of heavy footfalls approached. He likes to spit in the food, scrape off the top layer. Sable's stomach churned, but she did as he said, her fingers trembling as she discarded the tainted portion of her meal. And then there was Oren. Where Wall was steel, Oren was kindling. Where Wall taught her the mechanics of not dying, Oren taught her the art of not losing herself. He spoke to her across the corridor in the quiet hours between guard shifts, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur that somehow always carried a teacher's cadence. She learned over time why Oren had survived 4 years in a place that killed most prisoners within months. He was useful. A school teacher who could read, write, and count was a rare commodity among the Blackwood's brute force guards. They had drained him of every scrap of local intelligence in his first year, every patrol route and family name and village layout his border town had held. After that, any rational captor would have disposed of him. But Oren could do something none of the guards could. He could tally prisoner counts, read supply manifests, interpret captured documents, and keep the records that even a dungeon needs to function. They marched him through the corridors twice a week under armed escort, from the lower cells to the warden's office and back, a literate slave with a cell instead of quarters. It was degrading work, designed to break him. It had the opposite effect. Every forced march was a reconnaissance mission. Every supply manifest was a map of resources. Every corridor was measured in footsteps and memorized with a teacher's precision. 4 years of exploitation had given Oren Birch an encyclopedic knowledge of every lock, every turn, every weakness in the Blackwood dungeon. The thing they used to degrade him would become the weapon that saved them all.
Do you know the story of the moon goddess and the first wolf?
He asked her one night, when the silence had become so heavy she thought she might suffocate under it. She didn't.
Then let me tell you, it will take some time, and time, my dear girl, is the one commodity we have in abundance.
His stories became a lifeline. He told her myths of the old packs, histories of wars and treaties, fables he said he used to tell his students before the Blackwood raided his village and dragged him here. He told them with the precision of a man who had spent decades choosing the right word at the right moment, and the warmth of a man who had never stopped believing that words mattered. Wall listened too. Sable could tell because on the rare occasions Oren got a detail wrong, a low grunt of correction would come through the stone to her right. "Your neighbor disagrees with my account of the Battle of the Grey Peaks," Oren would say, amusement threading through his voice. "He is, unfortunately, correct. The eastern flank held for 3 days, not 2. I concede." It was during one of these exchanges that Sable learned something about Oren's cell that made her chest ache. She was describing the tiny crack near the ceiling of her own cell, the one through which she could catch a sliver of sky, and she asked Oren if he had one too. The silence that followed was a beat too long. "No, child," he said, his voice carrying no self-pity, only a quiet statement of fact. "My cell faces inward. 4 walls of stone, no window, no crack, no seam. I have not seen the sky in 4 years." The words hit her like a physical blow. 4 years. 4 years without a single glimpse of blue, of orange, of light. Every time I look through that crack, I'm feeling like I'm in a horror movie, she whispered. I'm not sure I can handle this. Every time I look through that crack, I'm looking for both of us. From across the corridor, a sound she had never heard from Oren, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, the kind a man makes when he has been struck not with a fist, but with an unexpected kindness. Well, he managed after a moment, that is the finest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. It was Oren who first noticed what was growing between Sable and her neighbor. She didn't see it herself, not at first. She only knew that she listened for Wall's voice with an intensity that went beyond gratitude, that the rumble of his low commands had become the most important sound in her world. But Oren heard the way Wall's voice changed when he spoke to her, how it dropped lower, gentler, shedding a fraction of its gravel. He heard how Sable's breathing steadied whenever Wall spoke, how she would fall silent in the middle of one of Oren's stories the moment the familiar clink of chains shifted on the other side of her wall. You two, Oren murmured one night, his tone carrying a knowing warmth that made Sable's cheeks burn in the darkness. You remind me of a story I used to teach. 2 rivers that run on opposite sides of a mountain. They never meet, but they flow to the same sea. Wall said nothing, but the silence from his cell felt different, heavier, more deliberate, as if he were holding his breath. She began to talk to Wall more freely, at first in hesitant whispers. She didn't know his name, and when she asked, he simply said, "Names are a luxury we don't have." So she started calling him Wall. It felt right. He was as solid and unmovable as the stone that separated them. There's a crack, she whispered to him one evening, her fingers tracing a jagged line in the mortar near the ceiling. High up. I can see a sliver of sky if I stand on my toes. He was silent for a long time. She thought perhaps he wouldn't answer, that she had presumed too much. What color is it? He finally asked, his voice rougher than usual. The question was so simple, so unexpected, it made her ache. It's blue, she whispered back, a deep, bruised blue, with streaks of orange and pink at the edge. The sun must be setting. She heard a soft sound from his cell, a choked exhale that was almost a groan. Tell me more, he commanded, his voice tight. And so she did. She described the way the colors bled into each other, the way the last rays of light turned the highest clouds to gold. She spoke of the sunsets she remembered from her home in Silvermoon, of the vast, open fields and the scent of pine after rain. She told him about the taste of fresh baked bread and the sound of festival music drifting on the summer air. She painted pictures for him with her words, filling the suffocating darkness with memories of a world he could no longer see. From across the corridor, Oren's voice came, barely a whisper. Orange, he said. I had forgotten what orange looked like. Thank you, Sable. The gratitude in his voice was so raw, so stripped of his usual dry humor, that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She realized then that Wall was not the only one she was painting these pictures for. She was painting them for a man who hadn't seen light of any kind in 4 years. A man for whom the word sunset had become an abstraction, a memory of a memory. And in doing so, she was painting them for herself. One evening she was describing the food she missed most. My mother's honey cakes, she said, her voice going soft and dreamy with the memory. She made them every harvest festival. The trick was in the lavender. Most people use dried, but she'd use fresh, and she'd fold it into the batter at the very last second so it wouldn't lose its fragrance. You had to eat them warm, straight from the pan, because once they cooled, the honey would crystallize, and it was never quite the same. And she'd drizzle this thin line of, "You are torturing a starving man." Wall's voice cut through the darkness, flat and deadpan. Sable froze, horrified. Her hand flew to her mouth. Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't think." A sound from his cell stopped her. Low, rusty, halting, like machinery that hadn't been used in a very long time, grinding reluctantly back to life. He was laughing. It was barely a laugh, more like his body remembering how the mechanism worked, and failing at it in the most wonderful way, to muffle the sound. Her shoulders, to muffle the sound. Her shoulders shaking. Oren joined in from across the corridor, his laugh a dry, wheezing thing that made them all laugh harder. For 30 seconds, maybe less, 3 people in a dungeon laughed together. It was the most absurd, ridiculous, inappropriate thing any of them had done in months. And it was the closest any of them had felt to being alive. When the laughter faded, the silence that followed was different. It was the silence of people who had shared something real, something the dungeon couldn't take from them. Wall cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was gruffer than ever, as if embarrassed by his own humanity. "If we ever get out of here, you owe me a honey cake." "When?" Sable whispered back, smiling in the dark. "When we get out." She thought she heard him exhale, not a sigh, lazier. "They won't check if you save some, lazier. They won't check if you save some of your water." Wall taught her the subtle language of the dungeon, the scrape of a particular bolt that meant the warden was making his rounds, the change in the guards' tones that signaled they were drunk, the distant clang that meant another poor soul was being dragged to the interrogation rooms. He was her unseen protector, his gruff, sparse words a shield against the soul-crushing despair. Oren, in his own way, protected her too. He drew the guard's ire onto himself with deliberate provocations, a sarcastic comment here, a muttered insult there, diverting their cruelty away from the new Omega prisoner. Sable could hear the sounds of what it cost him, the dull thuds and the sharp intake of breath, and her heart clenched each time. "Oren, stop," she begged him one night. "Please, they'll kill you." "They've been trying for 4 years, child," he rasped back, and she could hear the smile in his voice, thin and defiant. "But I can read and count, and they cannot, so here I remain. I'm beginning to think literacy is the true survival skill." In return, Wall gave her the gift of his presence, a steady, grounding weight in the cell next door. He never spoke of his own past, of who he was or how he came to be chained in the dark. He was simply Wall, and he was all she had. Oren, though, had no such reticence about his own history. He spoke of his village, of the students he had taught, of the mate he had lost to a winter fever 6 years before his capture. Her name was Lyra, he told them both one quiet night. She had a laugh like a creek in summer, always moving, always bright. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight it rarely showed. "She died in winter. The fever took her in 3 days. I held her hand at the end and told her I'd be fine." A long silence. "That was the first lie I ever told. I was a teacher. I prided myself on precision, on truth. And the first time it truly mattered, I lied." Sable pressed her palm against the cold bars of her cell, wishing she could reach across the corridor and touch his hand. "That wasn't a lie, Oren," she whispered. "That was love." "Perhaps," he said. "Perhaps they're the same thing sometimes." From the next cell, Wall was silent, but Sable felt, through the stone, the faintest vibration, as if something heavy and guarded had shifted. One night, long after the last guard had passed, Oren spoke again in that quieter voice. "I've been thinking, Sable, about what happens after." She felt her heart lift. "After?" "When we get out," he said, and she noticed he used her word, "faces west." "So the children can see the faces west. So the children can see the sunset during the last lesson of the day. I think that matters. Ending the day with something beautiful. I think it teaches them something no book can." Sable's eyes burned in the darkness. "That's a wonderful school, Oren." "It's just a thought," he said, his voice carrying that self-deprecating warmth. "A foolish old man's daydream." "It's not foolish," she said fiercely. "And I'll visit you. I'll bring honey cakes, the real ones, with fresh lavender." She could hear his smile. "I'll hold you to that, child. every harvest festival. You, honey cakes, and a sunset through my west-facing window. That is the deal. Deal, she whispered. From the next cell, a sound so faint she almost missed it, the clink of chains shifting, and then, barely audible, Wall's voice. I'll build the schoolhouse. The words were so quiet, so unexpected, that for a moment Sable wasn't sure she'd heard them. Oren made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. Well then, he managed, his voice thick. I suppose I'd better survive this after all. Their strange, three-sided bond became the axis on which their world turned. The daily horror of the dungeon faded to a dull background hum, and the hours were measured not by the guards' rounds, but by their conversations. Sable found herself telling them both things she had never told another soul. She spoke of the loneliness of being a quiet-wolfed Omega in a society that prized strength above all else, of the sting of being overlooked, of the quiet yearning for a place where she belonged. They see an Omega and they see a servant, she murmured to the stone one night, her voice thick with unshed tears. They don't see a person. They don't see me. And now, down here, even my wolf can't see me. She's gone silent. I can't feel her at all. It's like losing the last person who knew me. Wall listened, his silence a comforting blanket. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply listened, and in his listening, she felt seen for the first time in her life. Their blindness is their weakness, he said at last, his voice a low growl. They underestimate you. That can be a weapon, if you know how to wield it. Then, quieter, with a certainty that made her breath catch. And your wolf isn't gone. She's waiting. Trust me on this. Oren, from his cell, added softly, I was a teacher for 30 years, child. I have seen 10,000 students. And I can tell you, the ones the world overlooked were always the ones who changed it. Every single time. His words, and Wall's, planted a tiny defiant seed in her heart. They didn't see her as weak. They saw potential. One night, emboldened by a strange courage she didn't know she possessed, she returned to the idea that had been forming in her mind for days. There was another crack in the wall, lower down, almost hidden by the grime and shadows. It was small, barely wide enough for a field mouse to squeeze through, but it went all the way through. She could feel a faint, cool draft coming from it. Wall, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Are you there? A rustle from the other side, the familiar clink of his chains. I'm here. There's a hole, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Near the floor, on the right side. She heard him shift, the scrape of his body against the stone. A long silence stretched, filled only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, a soft scratching sound from the other side. I feel it, he rasped. A thrill, sharp and terrifying and wonderful, shot through her. My hand is right here, she breathed, pressing her palm flat against the cold, rough stone next to the opening. The thought was madness. To seek a connection, a physical touch, in this place of absolute isolation. It was a risk that could shatter the fragile peace they had built. From across the corridor, Oren held his million-billion breath. Oren held his breath. He could hear them, the whispered negotiation, the trembling need in Sable's voice, the careful shifting of chains from the next cell. He pressed his palm against his own cold wall and closed his eyes. Go on, he thought, for both of you. Take the risk. From Caspian's side of the wall, the world had been a monochrome of pain and gray despair. For months, the wolfsbane-laced iron of his chains had been a constant burning poison in his veins. It severed the connection to his wolf, leaving him hollowed out, a king without his power, a man without his other half. The Alpha King Caspian Devereaux was presumed dead, a victim of the Blackwood Pack's treachery during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation. They had lured him under a flag of truce and ambushed him in the Neutral Valley, 6 alphas and a dozen betas armed with wolfsbane. He had fought. He had killed 3 of them before the poison took him down. They didn't just imprison him, they erased him. The wolfsbane suppression killed his scent signature entirely, severing his pack bond as cleanly as a blade through a thread. 300 miles south, his wolves felt the bond go dark. To them, their king had died. His beta, Kale, had led the search personally, scouring the Neutral Valley for weeks. But the Blackwood were thorough. They planted evidence: his bloodied royal armor, scraps of black fur, the hilt of his shattered sword, all leading the search party south toward the Ashwood Ravine, a place wolves went to die. While Kale dug through rubble and bone in the wrong direction, Caspian was dragged north, deep into Blackwood territory, and buried in their lowest dungeon. The warden, Alpha Burke, didn't know exactly who he had. The ambush team that captured him had been killed in the fight, or scattered afterward. And the surviving handlers only reported that they'd brought in a powerful Alpha who had taken down 3 men before the wolfsbane dropped him. That kind of strength meant he was either a high-ranking warrior or a pack leader. And either way, he had intelligence worth extracting. Burke had spent months trying to crack him, alternating between wolfsbane torture and starvation, and getting nothing. Killing him before he broke would be an admission of failure, and Burke was too arrogant for that. Cracking the silent Alpha had become a personal project, a matter of ego. And so Caspian remained, chained and poisoned, a king on his knees in a cell that smelled of iron and despair. That was the cruelest part. Not the chains, not the poison. The knowledge that the people who loved him were looking for him and couldn't find him, because the people who hurt him had made him invisible. He had resigned himself to dying here, a failure to his kingdom and his people. Then she had arrived. Her terrified sobs had been an irritation at first, another sound in the symphony of misery. But her scent, even through the stone and the dulling miasma of the dungeon, he caught it. Faint, subtle, but unmistakable. Rain-washed wildflowers and a hint of sweet vanilla. It was a scent of life, of innocence, in a place defined by death and corruption. It was the scent of his mate. The recognition hit him not with a jolt, but as a slow, dawning warmth in the frozen landscape of his soul. His dormant wolf, a silent ghost in the back of his mind for so long, stirred. It was a faint flicker, a weak twitch, but it was there. Mate, the ghost whispered, a single word that held a universe of meaning. He had clung to that word, to her scent, as a drowning man clings to driftwood. Her voice became his reason for holding on. When she spoke of sunsets, he closed his eyes and tried to remember color. When she spoke of her loneliness, of her wolf going silent, his own wolf, his weakened, poisoned wolf, bristled with a protective rage that was so profound it was a physical agony. He knew what was happening to her. The same wolfsbane that chained his beast was smothering hers, and the thought of her small, gentle omega wolf, suffocating in silence, made him want to tear the world apart. He wanted to tear down the walls, to slaughter the guards who looked at her with contempt, to wrap her in his arms and promise her she would never be alone again. But he was trapped, weakened, a king on his knees. So he did the only thing he could. He guided her. He protected her with his knowledge. And he listened. He drank in the sound of her voice, the cadence of her words, letting it fill the empty spaces inside him. He found himself thinking not of his kingdom, not of his escape, but of her. What did she look like? Was her hair the color of moonlight or shadow? Were her eyes as soft as her voice? This nameless, faceless Omega had become the center of his universe. And Oren. The old beta across the corridor was a complication he hadn't expected. Caspian had known prisoners who had been here years, men and women who had been hollowed out until nothing remained but the mechanical act of breathing. Oren was different. Oren had been here 4 years and still told stories, still made jokes, still drew the guards' anger onto himself to shield others. It was either the bravest or the most foolish thing Caspian had ever witnessed, and he found that the distinction didn't matter. The old teacher had earned something from him that very few ever had: respect. On the nights when Sable slept and the dungeon fell into its deepest silence, It was Oren who spoke to him, not in the careful, protective way Caspian spoke to Sable, but in the quiet, direct manner of two men who understood the shape of suffering. "You're not who you say you are," Oren had murmured one night, weeks into their acquaintance. Or rather, "You're not nobody, which is what you keep implying." Caspian had said nothing. "I was a teacher of history," Oren continued mildly. "I recognize command in a voice the way a musician recognizes a note. Whoever you were before this place, you led people. And whoever you are now, you're still doing it. You just don't realize it." The silence from Caspian's cell was its own answer. Oren didn't press. He simply said, "Your secret is yours to keep. But know this, if the day comes when you need someone to believe in you, I already do." Caspian had stared at the wall in the darkness, something hot and unfamiliar burning behind his eyes. He hadn't wept since the chains went on. He came close that night. Wolfsbane seemed a fraction less agonizing. The connection to his wolf, once a severed thread, was slowly, painstakingly reknitting itself. It was her. Her omega essence, the unique signature of his true mate, was a gentle, persistent antidote to the poison that held him captive. And something else was happening, something neither of them understood. His alpha presence was reaching back through the stone, calling to her silenced wolf. The wolfsbane suppressed, but the mate bond was older magic, deeper magic. Two wolves chained by the same poison, healing each other through a wall. His wolf feeding strength to hers, her wolf feeding calm to his. A circuit of recovery that neither could have completed alone. Would feel a surge of warmth. I would feel a surge of warmth, a flicker of his alpha power, before the wolfsbane clamped down again. But it was enough. It was a spark. When she whispered about the hole near the floor, his heart, which he thought had turned to stone, gave a powerful lurch. A chance. A physical connection. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was a monster in the dark, a fallen king. He had nothing to offer her but more pain, more danger. But his wolf, stronger now, was not rational. Ours, it snarled in his mind. Touch her. Claim her. He dragged his aching body across the floor, the heavy chains clanking a protest. He found the small opening, a tiny break in his prison. He could feel the faintest warmth radiating from the other side, could smell her scent, stronger here. Vanilla and wildflowers and the clean, honest scent of her skin. Told him where her hand was, he mirrored. Told him where her hand was, he mirrored the action, pressing his own palm to the unforgiving stone. He was so close. He extended the fingers of his other hand, his knuckles scraping against the rough-hewn rock as he reached into the narrow gap. His fingers were calloused and grimy, his nails broken. He hesitated. What if he scared her? What if the reality of his touch was monstrous? But then, through the darkness, his fingertips brushed against something soft, warm, and impossibly real. Sable gasped as their fingers met. It wasn't a spark, not the legendary jolt of a mate bond she'd heard stories about. It was a slow, deep current of warmth that flowed from his touch, up her arm, and straight into her heart. It was a feeling of rightness, of coming home. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was unbelievably gentle as their hands found each other in the tight space. His fingers curled around hers, a fragile, desperate grip in the suffocating darkness. Tears she didn't know she was holding back slipped down her cheeks, but these were not the tears of despair she had shed on her first night. These were tears of profound, aching relief. She was not alone. She was being held, and deep inside her, in the place where her wolf had gone silent, something stirred. The faintest flicker, a warmth she hadn't felt since they brought her here, as if her wolf, buried under the wolfsbane's weight, had felt the touch too, and was reaching toward it. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, their hands linked through the stone, their breathing the only sound. No words were necessary. In that single, simple touch, a universe of unspoken things was exchanged. Comfort, trust, a desperate, blooming affection. It became their ritual. Every night after the last guard had passed, They would find their way to the crack in the wall and hold hands until sleep or the approaching dawn forced them apart. One night, with their fingers intertwined through the stone, Sable went quiet for a long time. Wall squeezed her hand gently, a question without words. "I was thinking," she whispered. "Do you think anyone out there is thinking about us right now? Like, at this exact moment, is someone looking at the moon and wondering where we are?" The silence that followed was different from his usual pauses. This one had a weight to it, a gravity that pressed against the stone between them. Caspian, on his side of the wall, stared into the darkness and felt the question cut through him like a blade. He knew the answer. His kingdom had mourned him. By now, his council would have named a successor. Kale might still be searching, stubborn as a winter wind. But even Kale would eventually have to accept the evidence that had been so carefully planted. The world had moved on. He had been erased, mourned, and replaced. The honest answer was that no one was thinking about either of them. They had been forgotten, and that was the Blackwood's cruelest victory. He couldn't speak. His throat closed around the truth and refused to let it pass. And Sable, hearing his silence, understanding it with a perceptiveness that pierced him to the core, whispered, "It's okay. I'm thinking about you. That counts, right?" He pressed his forehead against the stone. His wolf, that battered, healing creature, let out a sound in his mind that was half howl, half something quieter. Something like gratitude. "That counts," he managed. His voice was rough, broken at the edges, and he didn't care. It counted. Was what she gave him every night through that wall. Not just comfort, not just warmth. Proof that he was real. Oren knew about their ritual. He could hear the shift in their silence, the way the quality of the darkness seemed to soften on the nights they were connected through the stone. He said nothing about it directly, but his stories began to change. He told tales of the great matings of legend, of the Alpha King Aldrich who crossed the burning wastes for his Omega bride, of the Luna Seraphine who single-handedly held a mountain pass for 3 days to protect her wounded mate. He told them not as fairy tales, but as history, as proof that bonds forged in impossible circumstances were the ones that endured. "The moon goddess does not make mistakes," he said one night, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "She places her children where they need to be, even when the place is dark and the reason is hidden." From her cell, Sable felt Wall's fingers tighten around hers through the stone. From his cell, Caspian closed his eyes and let the old teacher's words settle into his bones like a benediction. Late one night, long after Oren's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, Sable lay with her hand through the wall, her fingers curled around Wall's. She was hovering at the edge of sleep herself, that liminal space where honesty comes easier because the guards of the waking mind have stepped away. "I wish I could see your face," she murmured, the words slipping out before she could catch them. A long silence. Then Wall said, very quietly, "No, you don't." She felt his fingers tighten around hers. "I'm not what you think I am, Sable." She was more awake now, her heart beating faster. "What do you mean?" Another silence, longer this time. She could almost feel him wrestling with something on the other side of the stone, something heavy and sharp-edged that he'd been carrying alone. "I have done things," he said, his voice barely audible. "I have failed people who trusted me. I have made decisions that cost lives. The man in this cell is not the man you've built in your mind. He's worse. And if you knew, you would pull your hand away." Sable lay in the dark, listening to the rawness in his voice, the self-hatred he wore like a second set of chains. And she understood something about him that he didn't understand about himself. He was not afraid she would reject him. He was afraid that the version of him she loved, the voice in the dark, the gentle hand through the wall, wouldn't survive the full truth. That the real him would kill the only good thing he had left. She squeezed his hand. "You're what I know you are," she said. "That's enough." He almost told her. She could feel it in the way his grip shifted, the way his breathing changed. His name sat right there, on the other side of the stone, ready to cross. But he swallowed it, he held it back, and he held on tighter. Because sometimes, love means staying in the version of yourself that the other person needs, even when honesty is screaming at you to tear it all down. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, the truth deferred for one more night. The touch was an anchor, a promise. For Sable, it was a validation she had craved her entire life. He held her hand not as an omega, not as a prisoner, but as an equal, as someone cherished. And her wolf was responding. Each night their fingers linked, the flicker inside her grew a fraction stronger. Not a full awakening, but a warming, like a frozen creek beginning to thaw. She could feel her wolf now, faintly, a drowsy presence stirring under heavy blankets of poison. It was reaching toward the warmth on the other side of the wall, just as she was, drawn by the same invisible thread. For Caspian, her touch was a potent medicine. The warmth of her skin seemed to burn away the wolfsbane's chill, feeding the growing fire of his wolf. The whispers in his mind grew clearer, more demanding. Mate, protect, free her, free us. The ember of his alpha spirit was no longer just an ember. It was a flame, small but growing, licking at the edges of his despair, promising a wildfire to come. The fragile peace of their hidden world was shattered by the arrival of Alpha Burke in the lower levels, with an air of ownership. His heavy boots, with an air of ownership. His heavy boots echoing with menace. He stopped before Sable's cell, his cold eyes raking over her small form huddled in the corner. "So this is the little stray from Silver Moon," he sneered, his voice a silken threat. "Hardly worth the trouble of feeding." Sable pressed herself further into the corner, her heart hammering. She could feel Wall's presence on the other side of the stone, a sudden, tense stillness. A low growl, so quiet it was barely audible, vibrated through the floor. Burke's lip curled. "What have we here? A little omega with a bit of spirit?" He crouched down, his face close to the bars. "I hear your pack is in disarray. Your precious Alpha King Caspian is missing, presumed dead. Tell me, little mouse, what do the servants hear? What whispers are there in the halls of Silver Moon?" Sable stared back at him, her chin trembling slightly. She knew nothing. Omegas were not privy to the war councils of Alphas, but even if she did, she would never betray her pack, her king. "I know nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Burke laughed, a short, ugly sound. "We have ways of making even the smallest mice squeak." "Leave her alone," Oren's voice rang out from across the corridor, clear and sharp as a blade. It was not the dry, amused rasp Sable was used to. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed past the border of caution into the country of pure defiance. "Your usefulness with a quill is the only reason you're still breathing." He walked to Oren's cell, and the sound that followed, a short, brutal impact, made Sable flinch. She heard Oren's breath leave him in a grunt, but no cry, no whimper. When Burke walked away, his boots echoing into silence, Sable pressed her face against the bars. "Oren, are you okay?" A pause. Then that dry, defiant rasp. "Perfectly fine. The man punches like a student who hasn't done his homework. No technique. All entitlement." From the next cell, something that might have been a choked, involuntary laugh came from Wall. Oren heard it too, and despite everything, Sable could hear the old man smile. On the other side of the wall, Caspian was consumed by a helpless, volcanic rage. Hearing Burke speak his own name, hearing this vile creature taunt his mate about his own supposed death, was a form of torture more exquisite than any physical pain. And hearing Oren take a blow meant to intimidate Sable, hearing the old man absorb violence with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything, added a new dimension to his fury. His wolf clawed at the inside of his mind, a raging beast demanding release. Kill him. Tear him apart. He touches what is ours. He pulled against his chains, a guttural snarl ripping from his throat. The wolfsbane flared, a white-hot agony that seared through him, forcing him back down. But the rage remained, a burning fuel. He had to listen, powerless, as Burke visited Sable's cell day after day. The warden never laid a hand on her. His cruelty was more insidious. He would withhold her food, describing lavish meals in detail. He would accidentally spill her water ration onto the filthy floor. Fear, Wall's voice rumbled to her later that night, tight with suppressed violence. Don't give it to him. When he looks at you, you look right through him. See the wall behind him. See the sky you described to me. He is nothing, a temporary obstacle. Sable took his words to heart. The next time Burke came, she met his icy gaze with a calm she didn't feel. She pictured the bruised blue sky with streaks of orange, the fields of her home. She let his taunts wash over her, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. From across the corridor, she heard Oren whisper, barely audible, "That's my girl." Her quiet defiance seemed to infuriate the warden more than any tears or pleas ever could have. Sable felt a change within herself, a subtle shift she couldn't explain. There was a presence again, faint and 100%. There was a presence again, faint and fragile, like a candle flame in a vast, dark room. When Burke threatened her, she felt it flare, a tiny spark of defiance that straightened her spine and cleared the fear from her eyes. She didn't fully understand it. She only knew that whatever Wall was, whatever he carried on his side of that stone, it was reaching through the wolfsbane and pulling her wolf back from the edge. And her wolf, drowsy and battered, was reaching back. Caspian was now actively using her presence as a weapon against his prison. In the dead of night, when their hands were linked through the stone, he would draw on her scent, on the steady, calming beat of her pulse he could almost feel through the wall. He would focus on that connection and pull. The first time he felt a link in his chains give, just a fraction of a millimeter, a surge of triumphant hope shot through him. It was a tiny victory, but it was a start. He worked at it every night, a silent, grueling battle. He would pull until the wolfsbane flared and his muscles screamed in protest. Then he would rest, drawing strength from her, and begin again. His wolf was no longer a whisper. It was a constant companion in his mind, a voice of primal certainty. Mate is in danger. The chains will break. The walls will fall. We will protect what is ours. The progress was agonizingly slow, but it was real. He could feel his own alpha power, so long suppressed, beginning to pool within him. It was a reservoir filling drop by drop, fed by the steady stream of her presence. He was becoming himself again. Not just a man, not just a prisoner, but a king, an alpha. And his mate needed him. He was running out of time. He could feel Burke's patience wearing thin. The warden's visits were becoming more menacing, the threats more direct. A storm was coming, and Caspian prayed to the moon goddess that he would be ready when it broke. The breaking point came on a cold, starless night. The silence of the dungeon was shattered by the heavy tread of multiple guards and the smug, triumphant voice of Alpha Burke. He stopped in front of Sable's cell, a torch in his hand casting flickering, monstrous shadows on the walls. "Well, little mouse," he announced, his voice ringing with satisfaction, "your defiance has become tiresome, and my pack grows restless for a bit of entertainment." He unrolled a scroll with a flourish. "By my authority as warden of this fortress and alpha of the Blackwood Pack, I hereby sentence the Omega spy from Silvermoon to public execution." Sable's blood ran cold. The words didn't seem real. Execution will be a fine spectacle. A message to will be a fine spectacle. A message to your broken pack that we are the true power in these lands. He laughed, a sound that echoed down the long, dark corridor as he and the guards departed. No. The word came from Oren's cell, not loud, not defiant. It was a single syllable of absolute refusal, spoken with the same quiet authority he used when correcting a student's fundamental misunderstanding. As if the universe itself had made an error, and he was simply pointing it out. No, that is not how this ends. The heavy silence that descended in their wake was more terrifying than the noise had been. Sable slid down the wall, her limbs numb. 3 days. She had 3 days to live. All the hope, all the fragile strength she had built, crumbled into dust. This was it. The end. She crawled to the wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Wall," she whispered, her voice a broken thing. "Did you hear?" The silence from his cell was absolute, a terrifying void. "Wall, please," she begged, tears finally streaming down her face, hot and fast. "Say something." She pressed her cheek against the cold stone, the sobs she had held back for so long finally overwhelming her. She cried for her lost life, for the sunsets she would never see again, for the mother who would never know her fate. And most of all, she cried for the nameless man on the other side of the wall, the man whose hand she had held in the dark, the man she had fallen in love with and would now never meet. "I'm sorry," she wept. "I'm so sorry." Oren spoke to her through her tears, his voice carrying none of its usual dryness. It was raw and fierce, and full of a love so paternal it split her heart in two. "Listen to me, Sable. You are not going to die here. Do you hear me? I did not spend 4 years in this pit learning every corridor, every lock, every weakness in these walls just to watch them take you from us. I swear it on Lyra's name. You will see the sun again. You will bring me those honey cakes. We have a deal, and I do not break my deals." From the next cell, the silence shattered, not with words, but with a sound that was barely human. A low, guttural moan that built into a growl of such primal, devastating fury that the stone beneath Sable's cheek vibrated. On the other side of the wall, Caspian was not silent. He was drowning. Her terror, her despair, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Her scent, which had been his life-giving medicine, was now thick with the cloying stench of fear and sorrow. It was a poison more potent than any wolfsbane. His wolf, the great alpha beast within him, let out a silent, soul-shattering howl of rage and grief. "No!" The word was not a thought. It was a command, a denial of reality, a declaration of war. "They will not touch her. They will not take her. Mate is ours." The reservoir of power he had been so carefully, so slowly filling, erupted. It was no longer a pool. It was a tidal wave, a tsunami of pure, primal alpha fury. The love he felt for the woman on the other side of the wall, a love forged in whispers and shadows, collided with the absolute instinctual imperative to protect his mate. The combination was explosive. The wolfsbane didn't stand a chance. It was burned away in a single, agonizing flash of white-hot power. For the first time in almost a year, Caspian was whole. The connection to his wolf slammed back into place, a feeling so overwhelming, so powerful, it brought him to his knees. The shift began. It was not the controlled, fluid transformation of a practiced alpha. Pain, excruciating and absolute, was a 100 million billion 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 billion. Pain, excruciating and absolute, was a distant roar beneath the overwhelming need to get to her. His skin split, giving way to a tide of thick, black fur. His senses exploded. He could smell every drop of her tears, hear the frantic, terrified beat of her heart as if it were in his own chest. The chains around his wrists and ankles, forged with dark magic and laced with poison, glowed cherry red as his alpha power surged against them. With a scream that was half human, half beast, he flexed. Metal groaned, stretched, and then snapped, the links exploding outwards like shrapnel. He was free. He was no longer Caspian, the man. He was the Alpha King in his purest, most primal form, a massive wolf, larger than any natural beast, with eyes that burned like molten gold. He turned his gaze to the wall. The stone that had been their only connection was now the only thing standing in his way. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the dungeon, he charged. Sable heard the scream and the shattering of metal from the next cell, and flinched, her terror multiplying. The guards were killing him. They had heard her crying and were punishing him for it. "No," she sobbed, pounding a weak fist against the stone. Please, no! Then came a sound that defied all reason, a deep, earth-shaking roar, followed by the impact of something immense hitting the wall. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Another impact, and a spiderweb of cracks appeared in the stone between their cells. Sable scrambled back, her mind unable to process what was happening. A third impact, and the wall exploded inwards. Stone and mortar flew across her small cell as a massive shape burst through the dust and debris. She screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. A wolf, a monster of a wolf, its fur as black as the dungeon's darkness, its shoulders as high as her head. It stood amidst the rubble, its chest heaving, its eyes glowing with an unholy golden light. This was it. This was her death. Not by an executioner's axe, but by the fangs of some beast the Blackwood pack kept in their dungeons. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a gentle nudge against her arm. She risked a glance. The giant wolf was looking at her, its head tilted. The golden eyes held no malice, no hunger. They held recognition, and a desperate, aching tenderness. It nudged her again, a soft whine rumbling in its massive chest. And in that moment, in the depths of those impossible golden eyes, she saw him. She saw Wall. The same steadfastness, the same protective certainty. It was him. Her mind reeled, unable to reconcile the gentle, disembodied voice with this creature of immense power. And inside her, her wolf, that small, drowsy presence, surged awake with a force that made Sable gasp. Not in fear, in recognition. Mate. The word wasn't hers. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere primal, somewhere that had been waiting in the dark just as long as she had. Her wolf knew him, had always known him, had been reaching for him through stone and poison and silence since the very first night. The wolf took a step back, and in a dizzying, seamless motion, the creature began to change. Fur receded, bones shifted with a series of soft clicks, and the monstrous form resolved itself into that of a man. He stood before her, tall and powerful, clad only in the tattered remnants of his trousers. His hair was long and black, his face was chiseled and severe, covered in grime but undeniably noble. And his eyes? They were the same molten gold as the wolf's. He was breathing heavily, his body covered in a sheen of sweat, but he moved toward her without hesitation. He knelt before her, his expression one of profound relief and adoration. He reached out a hand, not to the crack in the wall, but to her face, his calloused fingers gently brushing the tears from her cheek. His touch was the same warmth, the same current of homecoming. Alarms began to blare throughout the dungeon, the sounds of shouting guards growing closer. But he didn't seem to notice. His world had shrunk to the space between them. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Then he stopped. He turned toward the corridor, toward the cell across from hers, and for the first time, Sable saw the full measure of what he was. He shifted her weight to one arm, and with the other, gripped the iron bars of Oren's cell and tore them from the wall as if they were made of rotting wood. The sound of screaming metal filled the corridor. Inside, Oren was already on his feet, though Sable could see now, in the faint, sickly light of the emergency torches, how terrible he looked. Gaunt beyond belief, his hair completely white, his frame so thin it seemed a strong wind would break him. But his eyes, his dark, keen, intelligent eyes, were blazing with a fire she had never heard in his voice. He looked at the man holding Sable, and his face went through a series of rapid transformations. Shock, recognition, awe, and then a deep, knowing satisfaction. As if a theory he had held for months had just been proven correct. "I knew it," Oren breathed. "I knew you were no ordinary prisoner." He looked at Sable, cradled in those powerful arms, and his expression softened into something that was almost fatherly. "Go," he said, "both of you. I know these corridors better than Burke's own guards. They've been marching me through them for 4 years. I'll be right behind you." Caspian held Sable tight against his chest and began to move. He was a force of nature, a blur of controlled violence. Guards who rounded the corner were thrown aside with contemptuous ease. Locked doors were kicked from their hinges. Behind him, Oren moved with a speed and purpose that defied his frail body. The old beta had not been lying about knowing the dungeon. He called out turns and warnings with the precision of a cartographer reading a map. "Left here. The right corridor is a dead end. Next junction, take the stairs, not the ramp. The ramp leads to the barracks. 2 guards around this corner. They change positions every 3 minutes. We have 40 seconds." Caspian followed his directions without question. In another life, this man would have been his most trusted advisor. In this life, he was proving to be something far more valuable. They had almost reached the final stairway, the one that led to the surface, when the ambush came. A squad of Blackwood guards, 6 of them, poured from a side corridor, wolfsbane-tipped spears lowered and gleaming in the torchlight. Caspian set Sable down behind him, placing his body between her and the threat. A growl built in his chest, his alpha aura crackling with enough force to make 2 of the guards stumble back. But 6 against 1? With wolfsbane, and with his mate exposed and vulnerable behind him. The odds were brutal. "Take her up the stairs," Caspian commanded Oren, his voice carrying the full weight of a king's authority. "Do not stop. Do not look back." Oren moved to Sable's side, but the guards were already splitting, 2 circling to flank Caspian, 2 moving toward the stairs to cut off the escape. The remaining 2 advanced from the front, spears aimed at his chest. Caspian launched himself at the front pair, a devastating blur of alpha fury. He took the first guard out with a single blow that cratered the man into the stone wall. The second jabbed his spear forward, and Caspian twisted, the wolfsbane tip slicing a shallow, burning line across his ribs. He snarled through the pain and snapped the spear like kindling, driving the guard back with a blow that shattered his jaw. But the 2 flankers had reached the stairs. He was caught between them, and Sable was. He was caught between them, and Sable was caught behind him, with no path forward. "Go!" Sable screamed at Caspian, her voice raw. "Don't worry about me, just go!" Caspian roared, turning to face the 2 closing from behind, but it would mean turning his back on the ones at the stairs, leaving Sable exposed. Time slowed to a crawl, and in that frozen moment, Oren moved. The old beta did not hesitate. He did not plan. He did not calculate the cost. He simply acted, with the same quiet certainty with which he had told stories, with which he had corrected historical inaccuracies, with which he had said, "You are not alone, girl." He threw himself at the 2 guards blocking the stairs, not with strength, because he had none left, not with speed, because his body had been broken by 4 years of captivity. No one expected the skeleton-thin beta to attack. No one expected the skeleton-thin beta to launch himself at 2 armed guards with a battle cry that was half laugh, half sob. The impact carried all 3 of them sideways, off balance, spears clattering. For a single, critical moment, the stairway was clear. "Now!" Oren roared, his voice cracking with the effort. "Go, now!" Caspian didn't think. He grabbed Sable, threw her over his shoulder, and surged for the stairs. Behind him, he heard the sounds. The wet, heavy thud of a wolfsbane blade finding its mark. Oren's sharp intake of breath. And then, worse than any sound, the old man's voice, thin and fading but still, impossibly, carrying that ghost of warmth. Sable. Just her name, said with the same tenderness he had used on her first night, when he had told her she was not alone. Then, softer, as if speaking to himself, to the open air he could feel above him for the first time in 4 years, to the wife waiting for him on the other side of everything. "Lyra, I can see it. I can finally see the sky." Sable screamed. She screamed his name over and over, reaching back over Caspian's shoulder toward the sound of Oren's voice, toward the man who had told her she was not alone on her first night in the dark, toward the schoolhouse with the west-facing window, toward the honeycakes she would never bring him, toward every harvest festival that would now pass in silence. Caspian did not stop. His jaw was clenched so tight it could have cracked stone, and his golden eyes burned with a grief that was indistinguishable from rage. He had heard Oren's last words. He had felt the old man's life gutter out like a candle behind him, and he had made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He chose her. He chose the living over the fallen, the mate over the friend, the future over the past. Because that is what love demands in its cruelest moments. Not that you save everyone, but that you choose. He carried her up winding stone stairs, through corridors she had only ever heard about, and burst through a final door into the cold night air. He didn't stop until they were deep within the forest surrounding the fortress, in a small clearing bathed in the silver light of the moon. He gently set her down on a patch of soft moss, his hands lingering on her arms, as if to reassure himself that she was real. Sable's face was a ruin of tears. She was shaking, not with cold, but with a grief so profound it had no sound. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice shattered. "Oren, he's gone. He saved us and he's gone. He wanted a schoolhouse wall. He wanted a window that faced west. He wanted children to see the sunset. And he's gone." Caspian knelt before her and pulled her against his chest. He held her while she broke, his arms wrapped around her as if he could shield her from the pain. He pressed his face into her hair and breathed, and when he spoke, his voice was raw. "He was the bravest man I have ever known, and I have known kings and generals. None of them compared to a schoolteacher who spent 4 years in the dark and never stopped believing in the sun." He pulled back, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. The moonlight illuminated his features, cutting through the grime and shadows. The high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the air of innate command. She had seen that face before. In portraits hanging in the great hall of Silvermoon, on coins, in the hopeful drawings of children. Her breath hitched. "You're," she whispered, the name a fragile thing on her lips. "You're him. You're the Alpha King. Caspian Devereaux." A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of the burden he carried. He looked away from her, up at the moon, and then his gaze returned to hers, clear and unwavering. His expression softened, the weight of his crown and kingdom falling away, until he was only the man who had held her hand in the dark. "Nobody important," he whispered, his voice the same deep, rumbling sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. He reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely tender. "There is only you." The simple words shattered the last of her fear, the last of her doubt. He was not a king in that moment. He was Wall. He was hers. "My wolf knew you from the first moment," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Your scent, your voice. You were the only thing that kept me from fading completely. You saved me, Sable." "No," she whispered, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, over his heart. She thought of Oren, of his stories, of his defiance, of his final, impossible charge. "We saved each other. All 3 of us." Inside her, her wolf, fully awake now and burning with a fierce, quiet light, pressed toward him. It was small, yes, it would always be small. But it was hers, and it was alive, and it knew exactly where it belonged. A howl split the night, closer than she expected. Then another, and another, answering calls from the darkness. Caspian didn't tense. A slow smile touched his lips. "My men," he said. They never stopped looking. Soon wolves emerged from the trees, massive shifters who dropped to one knee, their heads bowed as they saw their king, alive and whole. "You were lost." "We searched the Ashwood. You were lost." "We searched the Ashwood ravine for months. We found your armor, your sword. The evidence said you were dead, but I couldn't—" His voice broke. "I couldn't stop looking." Caspian gripped Kale's shoulder with the force of a man holding onto solid ground after months at sea. They planted that evidence, old friend. They wanted you looking south while I was buried in the north. The wolfsbane killed my scent, severed my pack bond. You couldn't have found me. He held Kale's gaze. You did everything right. You never stopped. That is why you are my beta. Kale's composure crumbled, and for a moment the grizzled warrior looked like a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of a grief he'd been carrying since the day his king disappeared. Caspian never took his eyes off Sable for long. He kept one hand resting protectively on her waist. I was found, he said simply. He looked down at Sable, his golden eyes filled with a devotion that stole her breath. This is Sable Ashford, he announced, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for question. She is my mate, your Luna Queen. A collective gasp went through the assembled warriors. They looked at Sable, at her simple tunic and her omega scent, and then they looked at the absolute certainty on their king's face. Kale was the first to understand. He bowed his head deeply, this time to her. Luna, he said, his voice filled with reverence. The others followed suit, a wave of acceptance and loyalty washing over her. Caspian turned to Kale, and the grief in his voice was tempered by iron command. There is a man in that dungeon, a beta named Oren Birch. He gave his life for us tonight. I want his body recovered. I want him brought home and buried with full honors, as a hero of the Silver Moon Pack. Whatever family he had left, they will want for nothing for the rest of their days. And Kale, his voice hardened into something that made the assembled warriors shiver. I want Burke, alive. He has a great deal to answer for. Kale bowed. It will be done, my king. Sable listened to the orders, tears still streaming, but something was settling in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. Oren would not be forgotten. His name would not be lost to the dark. The schoolteacher who had outlasted 4 years of hell through sheer stubbornness and storytelling would be remembered, not as a prisoner, but as the man who cleared the path to the dawn. She was no longer Sable the Omega, the silent wolf, the prisoner. She was Luna, his. Caspian leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The world outside this small circle of moonlight, the politics, the impending war with the Blackwood Pack, the rebuilding of a kingdom, all of it could wait. My wolf will never let you go, he murmured against her skin, his breath warm. I will never let you go. She looked up at him, at the king who had been her fellow prisoner, at the stranger who had become her entire world. Run with me under the moon, she whispered, a promise and a plea. A brilliant, genuine smile transformed his face, chasing away the last of the dungeon's shadows. Always, he vowed. He was the Alpha King, a monarch reborn from the ashes. She was the Omega who had unknowingly held the key to his survival. Their love story wasn't written in the stars, but carved in stone, whispered through a wall in the darkest place imaginable. And in the throne room of Silvermoon, when it was rebuilt and filled with light once more, 3 things would hang in a place of honor above the king's seat. A piece of crumbled stone from the wall that had separated 2 lovers. A brass button from a schoolteacher's coat, found clutched in his hand, framed in silver. And between them, mounted on the wall where the afternoon sun would strike it every day without fail, a small, west-facing window of stained glass depicting a sunset in orange and gold and bruised blue. Beneath it, a plaque in Caspian's own hand. For Oren Birch, who never saw the sky but never stopped believing in the sun. The children of Silvermoon would ask about the window, and the king himself would tell them the story. Not of war, not of power, but of a teacher, an Omega, and a voice in the dark. And the truth that even in the deepest pit of despair, a single touch, a single voice, a single act of impossible courage could be enough to command the dawn. He led her by the hand toward his waiting pack, their fingers intertwined. no longer separated by a wall, but joined together for all the world to see.